Thanks so much for tuning in. It's a pleasure and a privilege to speak to you today, especially about one of the world's most historically important and intriguing civilizations, the great and culturally rich Kingdom of Angkor, which dominated the Indochinese Peninsula for over 600 years. Now, I'm Dr. John Freedman. Many of you may know me from past cruises in the South China Sea or the Gulf of Thailand, or river trips up the Mekong, or possibly from land excursions that I've led in Indochina or elsewhere. For those of you who I've not yet had the pleasure to meet personally, I do hope to meet you in the not too distant future when we'll all be exploring again. We'll be satiating our intense curiosity about our amazingly fascinating world. So I'll look forward to meeting you and to enjoying the travel and cruising renaissance of the not too distant future. It is going to be epic. Now, a bit about my background. I'm an independent scholar and lecturer. My field is best described as global studies, in that my work and travels have spanned 7 continents. I've been a guest speaker on board the Viking Orion in Asia, and have also been privileged to both lead educational travel programs and lecture for organizations such as National Geographic, the Smithsonian, a number of universities and museums, and numerous cruise ships and riverboats over the past 25 years. Now, my interest in Southeast Asia in particular has been very long-standing. It dates back really to childhood. I had a fascination with that area. I couldn't read enough about it, and when I was old enough to light out on my own, I did so, and I took many trips to Southeast Asia, including a 4-month honeymoon with backpacks 35 years ago, family trips, and I was also able to oversee a number of medical charity-related trips in my capacity as a physician, which was actually my primary vocation for 35 years. With a little lucky twist of fate a couple of decades ago, I was able to move into the role of expedition leader and lecturer, and that was a wonderful way to turn my hobby into an avocation, share my knowledge and passion for the region. When I actually retired from my clinical medical practice about 6 years ago, that lifelong avocation became my vocation in a sort of Angkor career, and here we are. So finally, I just want to note that in my 50 or so trips to Southeast Asia, as you'll see, I've been able to compile a rich photographic archive, which we'll use today to illustrate and bring to life the amazing world of ancient Angkor that we're about to explore together. So thanks again for tuning in. Buckle up for an exciting ride along the dramatic arc of Angkorian history, and here we go. Okay, so here we go. The Glorious History of Angkor. And, you know, if you look at that title slide, that iconic photo, it tells you a lot, because you're seeing the sun rise over what is actually the mausoleum, the tomb of the Sun King, Suryavarman II. And we'll go through that in great detail. It's quite exciting. Now, this lecture is really for 3 groups of people, I like to say. So let's use this little picture from the Bayonne. The first group of people, of course, are those who plan to go to Angkor someday. And that includes a large group of you, I bet. The second group is those who have been there. This, I think, will really enrich your understanding and add a lot of context. And then the third group are the armchair travelers who take joy in pondering the history and culture and will enjoy the photographs. So I think we've caught everyone there. I think this is for everybody. Now, I did want to mention that I will move rapidly. It's a scholarly approach. I've curated a list of books for you here, and you can download that very easily. The link to that will be on the wonderful Viking.TV website. So feel free to go ahead and do that, to download that list of books, these are the best of the best, and they cover a wide breadth of topics. Now, we also have books we also have internet sites as well, since we don't always have today, we don't always have time to read the books or carry them around. So just click on these URLs and you'll see some wonderful things as well. Now, I also do a lot of posting about travel-related subjects, and a fair number of my posts, which range really on subjects in history, anthropology, natural history, current affairs sometimes, a bit on COVID-19 and the what it means for travelers going forward. But most of it is historical. You'll see quite a bit on some of the topics we're discussing. So feel free to go to my Twitter site there. I also have, since I'll move fast, I'll also have an Angkor primer and a glossary, which you can feel free to take a look at. Just download that on the internet. Now, if we look at the Indochinese Peninsula today, very interestingly, what we see is Cambodia is the smallest country on the actual peninsula itself. Of course, Singapore is out on the Malay Peninsula down south there. But on the Indochinese Peninsula, we see Cambodia is the smallest nation, smaller than Vietnam, even smaller than Laos, and smaller than Thailand. But it wasn't always like that. Look at Angkor about the year 1200, when actually the city of Angkor was the largest metropolis on the planet, with 1 million people, much bigger than Cambodia that we know today. Now, many of you have heard my 7 Wonders of the World lecture, and it's a lecture that goes back to antiquity, really to Herodotus in the 5th century BC, looking at the history of the 7 Wonders of the World, the various iterations right up through the internet votes. And we review over 40 candidate sites, and the list that I come up with at the end of that lecture series really includes these, and I think you recognize them all quite well. Petra, the Great Wall, of course, the Great Pyramids, which were 2,000 years old at the time Herodotus saw them 2,500 years ago. The Taj Mahal, Machu Picchu, and the temples of Bagan. But as you can see, Angkor Wat and really the temples get the premier spot there. So we're going to take a look not only at Angkor Wat, but an important reminder here that there's much more. Angkor Wat is one of over 100 temples just in the central Angkor area, and one of several hundred that can still be visited, actually all throughout Southeast Asia, including in Thailand. And we'll see there's a little bit of an argument over who owns some of the temples. So these are all non-Angkor Wat pictures here. We'll go through this vast wealth of the possibilities there and the great history that goes along with that. So we'll look at prehistory, and we'll see that informs this in a very special way. We'll look at the early kingdom states such as Funan, Chenla, Angkor itself, of course, and Angkor itself had early, middle, and late stages. The prehistory, particularly important because in this case, that mythological history that we often see in prehistory really informs the story of Angkor in Cambodia, because the Cambodian people, their origin, their creation myth is that they were born of the Naga. And the Naga is this mythological, multi-headed, always an odd number, interestingly, and classically, the Khmer Naga has 7 heads. And they believe, this myth actually, that is actually taught in elementary schools, is that an Indian prince came across on those monsoon winds and married a Naga princess. And from that union, the Cambodian or Khmer people were born. So the Naga really goes back into the Jungian psyche and into the ancient origins of the Cambodian people. And the Naga watches over, it's a guardian of the city. Really, the Naga is the great landlord of Angkor. Now, Angkor itself actually derives somewhat indirectly, if you look at the provenance, but Nagara was the name of a great city, a city of the Naga. It was meant to be a city that had special significance. And that was in Sanskrit. Nokor is the Khmer or Cambodian word for city. If you put those together and just switch one letter, that Nagankor becomes Angkor. So it's a composite neologism. That's the origin of Angkor. And again, we'll see the Naga everywhere, not just in Angkor proper, but on every walkway and balustrade. There's a beautiful red sandstone engraving of the Naga. We'll see the most famous of all the bas-reliefs in Angkor Wat is the churning of the ocean of milk. And that, in fact, is the great Hindu myth. We see the devas there. These are the gods. You can always tell them by their cone heads. They have a cone-shaped hairstyle called a mukata. They're holding the Naga. Above them are the Apsaras, the heavenly maidens. And they're having a tug of war with that Naga, with the guys that have the fancy hairdos here. And those are the demons, or the Asuras. Overseeing it all is the great god Vishnu, to whom Angkor Wat was actually dedicated. So the Naga was used, and they would churn up the ocean of milk, and this is the origin of many, many things. Of course, the churning stick was Mount Mandara, which is actually one of the peaks of Mount Meru, the center of the Hindu cosmos, the abode of the Hindu gods. And on the back, Mount supporting it all, is one of the avatars of Vishnu, and that's Kurma. That's a turtle god, and there he is up close. So we've got our devas. They're everywhere. If you walk to Angkor Thom, which is a city just a mile north of Angkor Wat itself, we have the devas, again, with their mukata, their cone-style hairdos, and then we have the asuras, the demons there. Everywhere we look, we'll see the Naga. In your hotel, you'll see the Naga. At the Royal Palace in Phnom Penh, on every balustrade, you'll be greeted by a Naga. And in Thailand, which of course we know is a Buddhist country, but if you go to their main international airport, you've seen this. In Suvarnabhumi Airport, we have the churning of the ocean of milk. We've got the Asuras, the demons, are on the Gucci side, and the gods are on the Chanel side in this famous life-size depiction in Thailand. This is the classic Khmer Buddha, and in Hinduism, the Naga has kind of an ambiguous nature. Can be a little bit devious, can be good, associated with creation, with water. But in Buddhism, takes really, the Naga takes a very benign character. Remember, in some ways, Hinduism is the Old Testament of Buddhism, and the Buddha himself, of course, was a wealthy Hindu prince. So the Naga in Buddhism shielded the meditating Buddha from the storms, the monsoon rains of India. So very benign in that regard. And so you've seen innumerable depiction, again, always an odd number of heads of the Naga. And it's not just in Angkor Wat proper. This is way up in the jungle at Beng Malaya. And I noticed this on this little walkway here. We've got a Naga, and there's a sign on it that says, "Don't sit on the Naga." And personally, I want to say I think that's very good advice for a number of reasons. Now let's look into, beyond this prehistory, to real history. And the most important thing about the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, and Cambodia in particular, in this particular subject matter, is that it's in the shadow of these giants, these great and powerful and culturally rich civilizations of India and China. While the people, the Austro-Asiatic peoples, the Khmer peoples would be considered Austro-Asiatic, they really migrated via these great rivers. The Irrawaddy, you've probably been there in Burma. Chao Phraya runs right into Bangkok today. The Mekong runs through 5 countries, and the Red River, which really created what we know as the Vietnamese civilization and polity, the Vietnamese state. So it was peopled via the rivers, but the cultural influence came by sea. So from the south and the west, really from the west on the monsoon rains, we get the Indian traders, and we have an Indianized culture. And you'll see this particularly Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar. Whereas from the north and east, we have the Chinese influence, and we have the Sinicized culture. Now, again, from that south and west, which is most relevant to Cambodia, they came in on these monsoon winds, and they also went to Java. They would have to stay about 6 months until the winds would reverse, till they could go home. And they spread their culture, not by any kind of conquest, not by any kind of bellicosity, but simply by the power and richness of their culture. So also this Indianized culture, very importantly, came up from Java. So the first kingdom state, really polity, kind of the mother Cambodian state, though it grew in what we know today as present-day Vietnam, because the Viets from up north, actually, they were imperialists. They eventually took over the whole western side of that peninsula, but it wasn't that way for 1,000 years. So this first kingdom of Funan, let's think of that as sort of a proto Khmer state or a pre-Proto-Khmer state. Sanskrit was the language. We didn't just yet have the Khmer alphabet, but it was very much Hindu, very much Indianized, centered in the Mekong Delta, and like all Asian civilization, whether it's Japan or Korea or China or anywhere in Asia, it is all based on wet rice farming. This was the foundation of all Asian civilizations, including Funan, because it brings settlement. It brings metallurgy, which then can also be used for other things, but initially for farming. Communality, a social hierarchy, wealth stratification, territorialism now, and small kingdoms grow. The amazing thing is how, I just took this last year, is how similar many places in Cambodia and other places in Indochina look today to the way they might have looked early on. This is a rice paddy. This is right behind the Bayon Temple, which I'm going to show you. So still the foundation of Asian civilization. We're still reminded today of its importance. Now, Funan would grow over a few hundred years. Eventually it would become very important. But, you know, borders weren't the same then as we think of them now. What's known as Westphalian sovereignty from the European Treaty of Westphalia is the idea that there are linear borders. Really, in the ancient world, and particularly in Southeast Asia, it was more about spheres of influence, and these nations were maritime nations. In fact, it's the term mandala kingdoms has been used. Mandala, you know it as a diagram and it's used in a symbolic, artistic way, but it just means circle in Sanskrit. So many of these great kingdoms, the names of which you might recognize there were mandala kingdoms. They radiated out of one central area. And Funan was just like that. They're known as thalassocracies. And I mention this because the Greek word for sea is thalassos. So that's where that comes from. So Funan was very much a seaborne thalassocracy. Now, they had a trading center called Ak Eo. The actual political capital was probably about 40 miles north, but this great trading center of Ak Eo was connected actually by canals to the sea. And it is an unbelievably rich archaeologic site of ancient Funan. You can actually see this wonderful statue of Vishnu came from Ak Eo. It's in the Museum of Vietnamese History in Ho Chi Minh City. But this is really a Khmer Cambodian artifact. Now, in the 5th century, we get a breakaway state. Not so much a thalassocracy, seaborne trading, more agricultural, because it's more inland, and that was known as Chenla. It emerges as a breakaway state, and it's extremely successful there. You see on the east there, you see the Kingdom of Champa. Annam in that time wasn't called Vietnam. The people were the Viets, the irrepressible Viets, but they were, for a period of over 1,000 years, under the yoke, under the hegemony of China. In fact, what China called Vietnam at that time, you can see it up there, Annam. And you know what that means? That means pacified South. And I'm sure, as you know, the Vietnamese didn't take too well to that, and they managed to throw off the yoke of the Chinese, as they did the French and the Japanese, the Mongols, and others. But that Kingdom of Champa, just to the east of Chenla and Funan, is very important. That's a Hindu Indianized kingdom, had its roots in Java, came to Java via India, and we'll see that that really was the great enemy during the early years of the Khmer Empire, but there's a rich cultural exchange. Now, what happened is that Kingdom of Chenla eventually would grow. Here it is in the 8th century. It subsumed Funan completely, including all of the Mekong Delta and present-day Saigon. So you'll ask most Cambodians, and they'll tell you that in that fecund Mekong Delta really belongs to Cambodia. And if you go back far enough, it does. In fact, the city of Ho Chi Minh City, or Saigon, was actually a Cambodian city before the Vietnamese took it over. Now, the Kingdom of Chenla would now be very important. Now we see indisputably Khmer culture. They have their own script, which, by the way, is the first alphabet in Southeast Asia and is the ancestral alphabet of the Thai alphabet and the Lao alphabet. This is a highly Indianized society, and they worship Shiva. So Shaivite is the adjectival form of Shiva. It was Shaivite Hindu, and Angkor Wat, we'll see, would be a departure, an exception in worshiping Vishnu. This is the real proto-Angkorian and also proto Cambodia. Now, it's very hard to see much of the remnants, but I saw this on a river trip up the Mekong. We stopped at a place called Wat Hanchi. If you ever do that trip, it's up a very steep hill, which will take you a good hour to get up. But you can also pay $1 for one of the local kids to take you up on a motorcycle, which takes about probably under a minute. And they go slowly, and that's a good way to do it. But this is a Chenlanese stupa. The stupa, really just think of it as a shrine with relics in it. It's a reliquary. It may just have a statue in it. The great stupas, of course, have a hair or a tooth or a bone of the Buddha. In any event, or so it is said. In any event, that is a Chenlanese stupa there, made of brick, as you can see. Now, Chenla would split. There'd be a civil war. And that seagoing southern part, water Chenla, based on trade. The northern part, land Chenla, based on agriculture. Now, the Javanese, who were very powerful, they would come to dominate that water Chenla, and it would become a vassal state of the Javanese, where land Chenla maintained its autonomy. But something big would happen. The Kingdom of Chenla in 800, the Javanese overseers installed a young Khmer prince as a puppet ruler in water Chenla. And they took him to Java. He saw a lot of interesting things. They learned about their God King culture, about their rich Hindu, Indianized culture. But they picked the wrong guy, as we'll see, because a couple of years after being installed as the puppet ruler, he rebelled, this young Khmer prince. He liberated water Chenla from the Javanese. He reunited land and water Chenla. He ascended the throne as Jayavarman II, and we're just going to call him J2. And by the way, in my Encore primer, we'll review the three great god kings of the Khmer Empire of Angkor, and one that I think is a little under-recognized as well. So we'll throw in a fourth there. But J2, the founder, he declared himself the Deva Raja, the god king of a now united and new Khmer Empire. So he is the founder. He declared himself on the top of Mount Kulan, which is north of Angkor, in the waters, dedicated his kingdom to Shiva. Now, his capital would move north. You want to get away from the Javanese, and you also want to expand your empire. So it would slowly move north, eventually to that blue dot there on the map, which is the largest lake in Southeast Asia and is one of the most spectacular natural phenomena because it actually quintuples in size during the rainy season. So this is what things looked like. He would move north, first to a place called Indrapura around today's Kampong Cham, and then eventually up to a place which he called Hariharalaya, named after a god, Harihara, which we'll see exists today as a little town not far from Angkor, known as Roluos, with spectacular temples. So he's got his distance from the Javanese. And of course, you want to get up to that lake because that's water. That's called the Tonle Sap, that lake. There's a river that leads to it from the Mekong. It's a tributary of the Mekong, actually, called the Tonle Sap River. But that great lake, it's all about water, which means fish and rice. So there's an extraordinary hydrologic phenomenon that occurs here. This is the Mekong River. Now it flows in winter, and in spring there are colossal rains, and the volume of water flowing down, this comes all the way down from the mountains of Yunnan, China, through Laos, Thailand, Cambodia. Even Myanmar has a little riparian border with the Mekong. But there's so much water down there in the lower part of the Mekong in the spring that it can't handle it. It backflows. So this area then backflows, let's enlarge that a little bit, backflows up that Tonle Sap River, which reverses its flow instead of being a tributary, it now flows in the other direction, and it fills that Tonle Sap, already the largest lake in Southeast Asia, and it quintuples in size. So this is an amazing hydrologic phenomenon, and this is really one of the great ingredients, one of the great reasons for the 600-year success of Angkor, and probably for their downfall as well, as we'll see. So the Tonle Sap is a natural reservoir of the Mekong, and Angkor was a hydraulic city. We'll see all the reservoirs called bares in the canals. We've all built to capitalize on that. And I like to say that Angkor is under the hydrologic hegemony of the Mekong. It's really about what happens down in the Mekong, which feeds that Tonle Sap, which feeds the people and the civilization of Angkor. So we've got this Khmer Empire, which is now expanding nicely. And if we take a look here, so his first capital, J2's first capital, Indrapura, was this city now called Kampong Cham. This is a town that actually you can visit. There's some nice temples there and other things. On a Mekong River trip, you can often take a little day trip to that town. And then ultimately, they went up to Angkor. Today, it's called Siem Reap. The town wasn't then. It was called Angkor and even had other names, because even Angkor is a later name. But Siem Reap, by the way, and we'll see this is very important, Siem, Siam, the Thai, Reap, to defeat, to vanquish. They named that their city Defeat of the Thai. And in fact, they did defeat the attacking Siamese a number of times, but you only have to lose once, and ultimately they did. And we'll see that in 1431, that the kingdom of Angkor, the city of Angkor, would fall. Now remember, J2 went all the way up to Phnom, which means hill or mountain, Kulen. There's mountains up there. They're very important. He consecrated his kingship, his godly kingship up there, but that's also where they got the 10 million, at least, tons of stone to build Angkor Wat. If you go up there, again, another wonderful day trip from Angkor, you see the source waters of the river here that flows down to Angkor and eventually flows into the Tonle Sap. And you'll actually see in the riverbed, carved into stone, an early 9th century Shiva carved into the riverbed in stone. Still there, amazingly, and it dates to the time of the founding of the Khmer Empire. So that's Shiva. You'll also see these lingas. There's 1,007 lingas carved into the riverbeds dedicated to Shiva. It's quite something to see. Their antiquity is impressive. Their number is impressive. And remember, the linga is something I think you all know about, but the linga is the central symbol of Shiva. It will usually have a central place in any Shaivite temple, any temple dedicated to Shiva. And of course, the linga itself is the part that many people have said is phallic. There's a huge debate as to what extent this is erotic or sexual, and as to what extent this really is purely metaphysical. There's the yoni. Some could consider it the female part, the female essence. But really, if you study this and look at it, and any exegesis of any of the Vedic scriptures, you'll see this is really not meant to be erotic in any way. It has been eroticized. It's really about creation, about male-female principles, and is very much metaphysical. But if you see a linga, you're in a Shaivite or Shiva worshiping temple. So we get J2, that first great god king. He moves his capital away from the Javanese, away from the south there, up to Indrapura, and then to Hariharalaya, which really is this area around Rolos, the first place we'll look at, and several kings would build there, as we can see. And by the way, don't worry about any of these names or dates. These would be that Rolos period. Any history lecture, certainly my lectures, they're really like, think of them like a mosaic. If you go to Ravenna or to Jerusalem and look at a mosaic, you're not looking at each individual tile. The names, the specific dates don't matter. You're looking at the general picture. And also keep in mind that the reference list, and in particular my Angkor primer, will have a lot of this information in it. So don't worry about any dates or names. So this is a map of the greater Angkor area. You see Angkor Wat is fairly central there, but just a few miles away is that old capital. It's now called the Rollovos Group, because that's the name of the town, that old capital of Hariharalaya, just 8 miles from Siem Reap, so very easy. There's 3 great temples there. There's a number of smaller ones, and these are the temples that we'll take a look at now. They're all dedicated to Shiva. Now let's remember the Hindu triad or trinity called Trimurti in Sanskrit. You'll hear that term a lot. Brahma is the creator, Vishnu is the protector, maintainer, and Shiva is in many ways the most interesting, the destroyer, but really a transformer, rebuilder, renewer. You have to break things down and rebuild them to make something better. A very kind of synergistic idea, a whole being much greater than the sum of all its parts, emergence of things entirely new. Really, if you look at the history of our universe, the way back to the Big Bang, from the energy transformed to matter, and then the supernovas, the stars, of course, creating the chemicals. And as Neil deGrasse Tyson says, we're made of those chemicals. We're made of that stardust, all in this explosion. So Shiva, a very, very powerful symbol, and has a great deal of powerful meaning as the most widely worshipped of the Trimurti, and certainly in Angkor. So very much Shaivite, these early temples. Priya Ko is the temple of the sacred bull. Now, this was dedicated in 879. So think about that. Angkor was in the early 1100s. This is made of brick and laterite, which is a clay, iron, and aluminum mix that hardens to be like stone. Note the similarity, by the way, to the Chenlanese stupa that I showed you. Now, in a Shaivite temple, you'll see a linga, but in front, you'll see the guardian, Nandi, the bull. That's Shiva's guardian and mount, Shiva's steed. So whenever you see the bull, that's a temple that worships Shiva. Now, again, we said brick and laterite. By the way, this is what laterite looks like. It's bauxite, which has aluminum in it, and iron and clay, and it becomes like stone when it hardens. Often it'll have decorative facing. For example, on Priya Ko, you see this beautiful sandstone facing on it. This is Kala in the center there, the time-stealing demon, the devourer of everything, the demon of time. And below we see, notice there's some 3-headed Nagas there below him as well. So we'll see a lot more of Kala, and we've already seen plenty of the Nagas. Now, again, you see some beautiful inlaid carving. Dvarapala, don't worry about that. It's on the glossary. That's a temple guardian. Very often there's a set of 2. This goes back to ancient Hindu temples. It was borrowed and absorbed by Buddhism because religion in Asia is syncretic. They mix and mingle and coexist, not like our Western Abrahamic religions, which are very monolithic. So we'll see Dvarapalas, and we'll also see a particular type, which is a Devata. We'll see the Devata in the thousands when we get to Angkor Wat, and those are elegant guardian women temple gardens. So here's another temple, Lole. Again, we're talking 893, the year, versus the early 12th century for Angkor. But this is in many ways the most important of the Rollos group, because this set the tone for the next hundreds of years of building, and for Angkor Wat. It's called the Bakang, dedicated in 881 CE. It was built by a king named Midjavarman I. But this is just before, not long before the move to Angkor. Now, the thing about it is that it's the first state temple. They declared this was their great temple. They were proud of it. It's got that tower known as a prasat, the sanctuary tower. It's the first sandstone temple, no longer just laterite covered with brick and facing, but a temple built of stone. It's the first in the Temple Mount style. It symbolizes, it steps up as like a step pyramid, ultimately to Mount Meru, that abode of the gods and the center of the universe. So this Temple Mount temple, very, very important. We'll see indeed the apotheosis of that Temple Mount architecture will be in Angkor Wat. So it's the direct predecessor of the grandeur of Angkor Wat. and again would set the tone of Khmer architecture for hundreds of years. Who's it dedicated to? Well, that's actually Nandi, the bull. What's left of him? By the way, he was a white steed in myth, but that's the time has taken its toll on his color and tone. But this is, of course, Nandi as a guardian, because Nandi is Shiva's mount. So there we have the very important Mekong. Now, this was highly influenced by Javanese temples. If we look about the same time, go down to Java, part of Indonesia today, contemporary with Roloa, same time in Java, central Java, we have this, Prambanan. It's a Shaivite Hindu temple. It also worships the other Hindu gods of the Trinity, or the Triad or Trimurti, but the main central Prasat there, as you can see, and a little bit you can see how that might have influenced the Khmer architecture to a significant degree. So this was built by a Hindu dynasty at the time of a great thalassocracy that was based more in Sumatra, called Srivijaya, but during that period, Prambanan was built, and less than 50 miles away. So if we ever do a central Java trip, or explore the Java Sea together, you can visit both of these sites, because this is another temple called Borobudur. Many of you have been there, and this is a Buddhist temple. This was another dynasty, so they were competing, the Hindu versus the versus the Buddhist dynasties. So Borobudur also has that step style up to Mount Meru. You see that stupa on top. So again, very much influenced. These are important influences of Khmer architecture. There are also hundreds of Buddha figures looking out over the wonderful, wonderful setting there. So, but we'll see this idea of these Buddha faces looking out. We'll see that influenced later temples. Now, something big happened in the year 905, because that's when we moved to what we know as central Angkor. This is an area now about 5 by 15 miles. There are 76 temples there, 100 on this map, but 76 just in that area that's outlined in red there. But the first one, when it moved to Angkor proper, just a little bit further north, a little bit closer, of course, to the lake, we get Phnom Penh. Now, this was completed about 910 AD, so we're 200 years before Angkor. It's the first temple in central Angkor. It's less than a mile from where Angkor Wat would ultimately be built. And it's a grand scale temple. It had that temple mount design, missing some of the peaks of its towers today. It was sandstone, and it was the principal state temple for 2 centuries, and another inspirational precursor of Angkor Wat. Now, if we take a look here, we'll see not far away is a little temple, and that's also very close to Angkor Wat. And that's, although compared to the large Angkor Thom on that map and the largest religious structure in the world, Angkor Wat, we'll see this Phnom Penh here is very well positioned to take a look at Angkor. So it's up high on a hill too. Remember, Phnom means hill or mountain. So you can look back at Angkor Wat. This is a place to see the sunset. You're actually looking east, so you won't see the sunset behind it, but Angkor Wat itself will get this beautiful glow and change colors. So there's a look at it with a little bit of a zoom. So wonderful place to go up for the sunset. If you look west, you'll actually see the sunset. If you look east, you'll see Angkor Wat. Now, very, very importantly, Yasovarman I, who moved the capital to Angkor and deserves great credit. That's why he's sort of my special fourth unsung hero of the great Khmer god kings. About 910, he built the first great Barre. A Barre is a reservoir, but this is part of the hydraulic city. Yes, it has symbolic aspects. It symbolizes the cosmic ocean, the great cosmic ocean of Hindu cosmology, but it's also used for rice cultivation. And the barres, along with the network of canals, really underpin the strength and prosperity of the Khmer Empire for hundreds of years. So he had real vision, not to mention the engineering achievement It really was a main contributor, a foundational contributor, that hydrology and building this hydraulic city to the ultimate glory and dominance of Angkor. So this is 4 miles long, by the way. This is wasn't a small undertaking. Again, functional and symbolic. Now there's a barre over, by the way, that west barre is dry today. That east barre is dry, the first one, but the west barre, which was built later, that still contains water. And it was built not long after, and still after 1,000 years, it contains water, the west barre. There were temples in the middle of these barre, and there still are. And those are called Mebon temples. Any temple that has the word Mebon, M-E-B-O-N in it, it was originally, or still is, on an island in the middle of a reservoir, of a barre. Many of them now, because the barres are dry, just are up on a hill. So there was a brief 16-year period where a usurper, and there were constant usurpers, and there was always great violence. Successions in the Angkorian god king lineage were never smooth or uncontested. So for a brief 16-year period, a usurper moved the kingdom north to a place called Khmer, not too far away, but you've probably heard of it. It's about 60 miles or so northeast of Angkor, a great day trip. There are many temples there. It's called the Khmer complex. This is one called Prasat Tam. Remember, Prasat means sanctuary or tower or pyramid. It's really a holy sanctuary place. I've always fascinated, given the timing of this, a little horizontal history here. Notice the date. So we're getting close to 1000 CE, just about the same time as the great pyramid of Kukulkan or El Castillo in Chichen Itza. Very similar in structure, and yet there was certainly, I think we can say that with virtual 100% certainty, no communication. So very, very interesting. Now you might have seen in the news some of the statuary from Khmer, because it's beautiful. Here's a statue of Duryodhana, one of the heroes, one of the two cousins who fight in the epic climactic battle of the Mahabharata, one of the two great Hindu epics, along with the Ramayana. Now, this statue of Duryodhana, and he was fighting his cousin Bhima, who ultimately prevailed. Sotheby's had acquired it, and they advertised it for sale for just about $3 million. But the Cambodian government saw this and said, wait a second, I think we own that. I think that was stolen. And they made a case for it. And I love this headline: return our treasures, repair our people's souls. And heaven knows the Cambodian people, after what they went through during the Khmer Rouge period, if anybody needed solace and reparation of their soul and the soul of their country, it was certainly the Cambodians. So they tried to get the statue back. They were not initially wasn't met with much success. Sotheby's said, no, we don't think this was stolen. We think that's rather far-fetched. So the good news is Sotheby's did the right thing when all this came out, and they agreed to return the statue of Duryodhana. So that's very important. It's a 500-pound statue, so it wasn't easy to transfer. But this 10th century statue arrived home on May 29th, 2014. And better yet, his cousin, although they were mortal enemies and Bhima killed Duryodhana, the press likes to celebrate that these cousins, or twins as they call them, are reunited, because Norton Simon did the right thing. They had the other statue of that pair, and they're all back in Cambodia now. You can see them at the National Museum in Phnom Penh. And at the same time, the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art realized that the famous kneeling attendants, these are Dvara Palas, right? They're guarding a temple. Well, they were guarding the Southeast Asian exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art since 1994. But it turned out that they weren't really able to be certain about the provenance. Now, the collector, I'll leave the names out here. We don't do anything ad hominem. So the collector or donor of the kneeling attendants said this: well, admittedly, these things were moonlighted out of Cambodia, wound up somewhere else. But had they not been, they would likely have been shot up for target practice by the Khmer Rouge. Collectors and museums were essential in rescuing and caring for cultural artifacts. So while it may be true that there was some fighting around the temples, there are a few bullet holes actually at Angkor Wat when the Vietnamese invaded Cambodia after Pol Pot had invaded Vietnam in 1979, there was a brief battle there. So there are some bullet holes in Angkor Wat, but again, this wouldn't justify the quote moonlighting of these great works of art. Here's another great one, Hanuman. This is from the Ramayana, the great monkey general. We'll see more of him. The Cleveland Museum had this, and they sent it back to Cambodia. So now we see that we had several temples being built in that area around Rulos, and the capital gets moved up to Angkor, which is just a little bit to the north there. And now we get the real golden era of temple building. And this would begin under a successor king, and it would build some amazing temples here, Banteay Srey and Preah Vihear. Now, Banteay Srey is unique. Again, look at this. We're 150 years before the first stone was laid at Angkor. So it's quite unique. It's a reddish pink sandstone. It changes color depending on the time of day and the angle. Best to go in the morning because unlike Angkor Wat, there's not a lot of places to get shade here. So best to go when it's cool. But it's famous for its small, intricate carvings. It's also different from all the other temples in that it wasn't built by a king. It was built by a courtier, a very powerful one, who was granted some land. And it's just as you can see, it's about actually 12 miles or so northeast of Angkor Wat. So a very easy morning trip. It's quite beautiful in its gopuras, that's a word you'll see in the glossary, these portico entryways. Its name that we know it as, Banteay Srey, means Citadel of the Women. Unclear why, and it's a newer name. It initially had a name, of course, it was dedicated to Shiva like the others, so it had a complex name called Shiva, Great Lord of the Threefold World, Tribu Vanama Shavara, but everyone knows it's at Banteay Srey. Why it's called Citadel of Women? Maybe, some say, speculate, it's elegance, maybe there's its scale, maybe there's something, its beauty, something feminine about that to certain interpreters. Or maybe because there are many devata, there are many female guardians. But again, you see this jewel-like carving, still magnificent after 1,000 years. The finest carvings are what we call on the pediments. I'll show you more about that shortly. This is Shiva, the god, on the head of, he's actually mounted on his steed, Nandi the bull, and sitting just behind him, just like we see today, on a Cambodian motorcycle, we see a man with a woman sitting side saddle on the motorcycle. We have Parvati, Shiva's wife. She's unfortunately headless, but she's there just behind him. She has another name, by the way, Uma. Uma and Parvati are the same, if you see that. So there's Shiva on his steed, Nandi, and there he is a little close up with the unfortunately headless Parvati. Now here's Shiva doing this dance called the Nataraja dance. The dance itself is called the Tandava. It's a frenetic dance of creation. And this image of Shiva doing this dance, creating the universe as we know it from prior ingredients, very much Big Bang-like in a way. Nataraja means Lord of Dance. This may be the most famous iconic image of all of Hinduism, really. You've seen it more famously. You see the frenetic Tandava dance, a dance of creation. You see this in bronzes. These are classic 10th century Chola South Indian bronzes. I've tweeted a number of interesting posts about Shiva Nataraja, the Lord of Dance. And lo and behold, here's Bhima and Durojanya. Remember the cousins that made their way back to Cambodia. Here they are at that famous Battle of Kurukshetra in the Mahabharata. And I love this. Maurice Glaise is one of the greatest cultural anthropologists and art historians of Angkor. And he said this: with its near perfect ornamental technique, Banteay Srey represents the highest expression of Khmer art and architecture. Here's Indra on his three-headed elephant. Indra, the god of thunder and the skies, rides his three-headed elephant known as Airavata or Erawan, same. Again, these are usually carved on, the pediment is this triangular or sometimes almost semicircular region here above a doorway. That's the structure. The actual face of it, which is carved, is called the tympanum. I wouldn't worry about that too much. So there's a pediment there. And the crossbar below it, which is also a prime area for beautiful carving in all of these temples, is known as a lintel. By the way, notice the anthropozoomorphic monkey warrior guardians. These are probably members of Hanuman's monkey army. Now, here's another great one from the Ramayana on Bante Saray. We have Ganesha, we have Shiva up top, and then we have his son, Ganesha, elephant head, human body. That's a great story for another day. Then we have Hanuman, the loyal monkey warrior who helped Rama, the prince, rescue his princess Sita from this demon king Ravana, who's one of my favorite characters. Let's zoom in on Ravana. He's very, very interesting. He's not all bad. He's brilliant. In many situations, he has great integrity. He's at times quite reasonable, but ultimately he is a demon king of the mythical land of Lanka. He has 10 heads. If you count them all, you'll see 7, but there's 3 on the back there that you have to imagine, and 20 arms. And Rama would fight him to rescue his wife Sita. He would also enlist the monkey army, the twin monkey king brothers, Sugriva and Vali. This is from the Ramayana. There's Hanuman, who was a great warrior general, loyal to Rama, and ultimately Sugriva would side with Rama and Hanuman, and Rama would kill Vali. That's what's happening there. Here's the burning of the Khandava forest from the Mahabharata, the other great epic. In fact, the longest epic that's ever been written in the history of humankind. So Indra, the Khandava forest, the god of fire, Agni would burn the forest below, but Indra, remember the god of thunder and rain, would then extinguish the fire. There's Indra up there on the 3-headed elephant extinguishing that fire. You'll see Kala everywhere. Now, Kala is the demon time, devourer of everything, but that also makes it what's called an apotropaic temple guardian. Very simple, a talisman that wards off evil. Apo means away, and trope is to turn. So we all know, we all have seen apotropaic talismans. Now, Kala was always one of the favorites. Notice he has no lower jaw. Very interestingly, he never has a lower jaw. It's thought that the antecedents of these temple guardian faces were human skulls in much more primitive times. And the jaw on a human skull, the mandible, will actually fall off after not too long a time. So it's thought that this was the antecedents, the ancient origins of Kala might have been human skulls to ward off evil. And of course, many Devata, beautiful, elegant women temple gardens in this citadel of women. Now, Andre Malraux was an amazing figure, daredevil, world traveler, novelist, critic, rogue, ultimately a statesman. He had a great affinity for Indochina. He ultimately actually became a French minister of culture. But in 1923, at the age of 21, he went into the jungle, which is where Bante Saray was, though didn't have nice roads and the area cleared out around it. And he stole a number of the Devata. And he was caught and he was arrested by the French colonial authorities. But he subsequently recovered from that and became France's Minister of Culture. I like at his, it's very hard to describe Andre Malraux. Raymond Aron, one of his friends, described him at his funeral as 1/3 genius, 1/3 false, and 1/3 incomprehensible. But we'll finish, we'll see, with a beautiful, beautiful quote from Andre Malraux, who loved Indochina and its art. So again, we won't worry about all the names and dates, but another one from this period you might have seen in the news. This is early 11th century. It's way up on a plateau, and you can see for miles around it. It's a similar style. It's known as the Bante Saray style there. And it's not as grandiose. It's fine, like Bante Saray. But look at that green dot there. That's Preah Vihear. Look how close it is to the Thai border. How close is it? Very close. They actually built the border around the temple. So the dispute, which you've read about in the news, likely between Thailand and Cambodia over this temple, is not really about the temple itself, because there's a number of Khmer temples, some beauties in Thailand. It's because of it's a border dispute, really, and it's gotten quite complicated and at times quite bloody. Back in 2009, there was quite a flare. A number of people died. It's become part of internal Thai politics, where one of the political parties, the nationalists, say, we want Phra Vihear. We don't want it to be Cambodian. And they protest and want it back. Now, in 1962, the International Court of Justice at The Hague actually ruled in favor of Cambodia, and they reaffirmed that ruling in 2013. But as you can see here from that lower headline, many of the protesters, again, the nationalists, what used to be called the yellow shirts before the last Thai coup, suppressed any kind of demonstration or dissent, but that more conservative nationalist royalist party, they still want that temple back. So it's a beautiful temple in and of itself, and there hasn't been any major violence in the past few years there, fortunately, but it's far from settled. And then we get to Angkor Wat, which would become, of course, the crown jewel. Now, again, I said we've talked about, we looked at temples that were built hundreds of years before this, but during the reign of this king, in fact, the exact 37 years of his reign is when Angkor Wat was built, and that's King Suryavarman II. And we all know that this is the pride and joy of Cambodia. It's even on their flag. So there's S2, we'll call him. Suryavarman means the Sun King, or Varman actually means protector. So Jaya Varman, remember J2, that means Jaya is victory, and Varman is protector. Suryavarman means sun protector. He identified himself as a kind of sun king. You can tell, as we'll see further on, that this is a very important person. Look at the number of paracels. There's over 15 there. So he expanded the empire. He greatly expanded the hydrologic structure. So we'll see that he is one of the second of the great god kings, and he built the magnificent Angkor Wat, and there it is, centrally there. Now, this uniquely faces west. Most of the other temples, almost all of them face east, because east is the direction of Shiva, but west, and the area of where the sun sets, that's the direction of Vishnu, and there's Vishnu. That, by the way, is a bronze contemporary with Angkor. Unfortunately, almost all of the great bronze work was, we would say, moonlighted, spirited, otherwise made its way out of Cambodia. So this one is actually in Berlin, but this was at the same time when it was a departure. S2 made his temple in honor of Vishnu, but it probably has something to do with the fact that he also envisioned it as his own mausoleum. So it has a funerary function as well. So this is the largest religious structure that's ever been built in human history. The way it's oriented, that's what gives you these wonderful sun rising over the tomb, the mausoleum of the Sun King. Many of these, by the way, were taken with my or my wife's iPhone. Some of them were taken with more sophisticated cameras, but it's not hard to get magnificent pictures. And again, think of the meaning here of the sun eternally rising behind the tomb of the Sun King. This, by the way, the reflections are so great in the barres and the reflection pools around it that this is actually just a reflection. So Angkor Wat, Angkor means capital. Remember, going back to that Nagara. Wat is a temple. Its original name, as best we can tell, they don't have the earliest stupas, or stelae they would be called, the stone pillars. But they see references on other stelae that at some point, not long after it was built, it was referred to as this Parama Vishnu Loka, which just means the great sacred realm of the Lord Vishnu. So again, not Shiva. Largest ever built, and really the apogee of classical Khmer architecture, at the apogee of Khmer political and military dominance in Southeast Asia. The first Westerner that described it in 1586, a Portuguese friar, Antonio de Madalena, said it's of such extraordinary construction that it's not possible to describe it with a pen, particularly since it is like no other building in the world. It has towers and decoration and all the refinements which the human genius can conceive of. And just keep in mind that it was covered with quite a bit of jungle already at that point. So it's almost a mile on each side just of that moat, which again, functional and symbolic, the great cosmic ocean, but functional as well for irrigation, like the barrays. And the moat it surrounds the greater Angkor, and all that forested area between the temple and the moat, that was a city. And in the greater Angkor area, those were residential areas. The homes were made of wood, so they're all gone. It's jungle now. Only the stone survives. But in fact, the greater Angkor area in the year 1200 is estimated to have had about 1 million people in it. It's the largest urban center in the pre-industrial ever in the pre-industrial world. And in about 1200 CE, when Angkor had 1 million people, London had maybe 40 or 50,000. So just an idea of the scale here. You enter from the west via this causeway. Here's the way it looks from above. The west is the entryway there, and that enables you to slowly approach the temple. You're approaching the abode of Vishnu here. There may be quite a few people there, more and more. Of course, not right now, but when we get our wonderful travel renaissance, it will be magnificent, and they're taking time to do some restoration during this time. Surrounded by galleries, this is where we'll see fantastic carving in these galleries that you can see here. We'll take a good look at them. The perimeter, 3.5 miles there. So just want you to get a sense of the enormity of this structure and remember when this was built in the early 12th century. Again, the Temple Mount, right? It steps up. This has 3 levels here. It steps up 3 rectangles in an almost pyramidal style. And then we get these prasats. We get an arrangement of 5 with 1 in the center. And that's known as a quincunx. So that's a word for all your Scrabble players. You put that word down and you're going to win the game. The quincunx, the 5 towers. It steps up. You can't go to the central sanctuary, but you can still go to the other 4 of that quincunx. And they're notoriously steep. The idea was that the steepness represented the difficulty of reaching any kind of divine presence or insight. And in fact, the risers are longer than the treads there. So you have a little rope there to help you climb up to these prasats. Now look at the shape of it. I picked this lotus one day, a trip up the Mekong. We went just about sunrise, and there was this beautiful field of lotus that just hadn't opened yet. As the sun rose, look at that silhouette, and we can really see what inspired the shape of these prasats or towers. That shape itself is called a prang, P-R-A-N-G, but the structure, when it has a sanctuary, religious, holy significance, is known as a prasat. Now, the astronomical associations of Angkor Wat are so many that that's a whole separate lecture. And in fact, if there's a lot of material here for you, do understand I'm condensing a few lectures into one, but I think it'll be worth your time, because if you can't absorb everything, and I don't think anybody could, remember there's that reading list where you can delve into anything that has resonated with you. And there's, of course, the primer as well. And you can even watch it again if anything went by you too fast. But one of the important astronomical associations that I want to mention is aligned perfectly in the north-south axis, but very slightly offset a few degrees in east-west, so that on the spring equinox, the sun will rise dead center over the central tower, and the figure of Vishnu, remember, Lord of the Sun, and the idea is that S2 was an earthly incarnation of Vishnu, is illuminated by direct sun. So remember that churning of the ocean of milk with the Naga and our demons. The reason there's 91 demons and 88 gods is to get the angle perfect so that Vishnu will be illuminated every March 21st or so on the vernal equinox. So really amazing. So there's those galleries, and you can see those circle around. There's over a half mile of carvings. You know, the National Geographic Archive is absolutely amazing. You can get every issue since 1888, when National Geographic was founded. I love this 1912 issue here. There's an article about the forgotten ruins of Indochina, and they open with the statement, few people have heard of Angkor Wat. Well, not true anymore. But then they go on to say something that's still true. It is the most richly and profusely carved building in the world. And I think that's something that, with all its grandeur, we have to remember. All of these areas, some of that print in white may be too small to read, but each one of those, the churning of the ocean of milk, the army of Suryavarman, actual depiction, it was contemporary at the time, the Battle of Kurukshetra, which was, again, the epic climactic battle of the Mahabharata epic, the Battle of Lanka, that's from the Ramayana. That's an epic final battle between Rama and the demon king Ravana. All of these and many other things are depicted in these galleries, which interestingly are designed to be viewed to walk around counterclockwise, which is different from traditionally in Hindu temples, one moves clockwise. But again, this is likely linked to the idea that this was built as a mausoleum for Suryavarman II, for S2, because in funerary rites in Hinduism, one walks counterclockwise. So if you want to look at this linearly, in terms of chronologically, the way these battles play out, you would go counterclockwise. So there we go. The Battle of Lanka. This is from the Ramayana. There's Hanuman on the left there. We can see here, that's what a gallery looks like. And on the right side of the wall is where you see there's Rama with his arrow. There's Hanuman, his loyal ally. There's some of the monkey warriors. Now, just a little bit about Hanuman. You've seen innumerable depictions of Hanuman. But the important thing about him, and here's one of my favorites. This is actually from Mangalore, India. He is loyal. He has Rama and Sita in his heart. You'll never find a more loyal friend and ally than Hanuman. There's Ravana, the demon king of Lanka. If you look closely, we've got the 10 heads, we've got the 20 arms, and he'll appear in this Battle of Lanka. But again, this is a very multifaceted and interesting character. There's a South Indian Ravana on the left, and there in Thailand, in one of the holiest Buddhist temples up in Ayutthaya, which is a lovely 50-mile ride up the boat ride up the Chao Phraya, or you can also do it over land from Bangkok. We'll see in one of the holiest Buddhist shrines, we'll see, because religious is syncretic in Asia, it mixes and mingles and coexists. We'll see Ravana there. That's a very nice carving of Ravana. Now, remember that churning of the ocean of the milk, which created these apsaras, by the way, these heavenly maidens. There's the gods holding the Naga there. There's, of course, the demons there. We'll also see on the left there that holding the head of the Naga is a multi-headed demon, likely Ravana. Could be another demon, but most likely it is Ravana. And holding the tail, helping the gods, the good guys, is likely Hanuman. Could be another monkey warrior, but it's most likely Hanuman. The interesting thing is that those are figures from the Ramayana, which have absolutely nothing to do with the ancient creation myth, the churning of the ocean of milk, absolutely nothing at all. But the Khmer's improvised, and they were creative and put them into that myth. Here's the army of S2. Here are some of his soldiers, and these are beautifully carved. There's the king himself, and we even see some Thai conscripts. The headwear and the style of these warriors, these were likely conscripts into the Khmer army. Could have been mercenaries, but more likely conscripts. The Battle of Kurukshetra, remember, that's from the Mahabharata. That's where Bhima and Duryodhana had their fatal fight there. And there we see all of these battle scenes. And now we get to the women of Angkor Wat. In fact, the fabulous women of Angkor Wat, at last count, there's 1,796, and those are the surviving ones. There were probably 2,000 or 3,000 at one time. Some of them are these elegant devatas, others are the apsaras. The devatas are quite elegant. They're dignified demigoddesses. They're guardians. They're usually in singles, sometimes in doublets. Very different from those apsaras, who again were one of the great creations of the churning of the ocean of milk. Those are dancing nymphs. They're sensual. They're scantily clad. So they're sometimes been called celestial pin-up girls. They were often used by the gods, by the way. They're always in groups, they're never alone. They were often used by the gods to seduce demons. Sometimes we'll get a mix. We'll get a devata that is elegant, but also starting to get a little bit sensual. And sometimes the devatas that are usually single will be in groups. So these aren't dancing maidens floating like apsaras. They're kind of like a hybrid. Really fascinating to look at the Angkor Wat. Every face is different. Every outfit is distinctive. And some say that these were based on real people and that Angkor Wat is in fact a 12th century Facebook. You can take a look at that online. There's a wonderful novel written. It's historical fiction. It's accurate. It's imaginative as well. And it's set in the time of the building of Angkor Wat about a woman of Angkor. Now, looks a little horizontal history. Angkor Wat, same time, Notre Dame. Just to put this into perspective, always nice to do a little horizontal history. So again, the Khmer Empire, they attacked Vietnam, but guess what? What's the lesson? Never mess with the Vietnamese. They had now freed themselves from China, so instead of being called Pacified South, Dai Viet, they're now Pacified South, which was called Annam, they're now called Dai Viet, Greater Viet. And they would eventually take over that kingdom of Champa and the whole Mekong Delta from the Khmer. But they got a bloody nose when they attacked the Vietnamese, as have the Chinese, the French, the Japanese, the Americans, anybody. The lesson is don't mess with the Vietnamese. So they weren't able to take over Dai Viet. They did take little pieces of Champa, but Champa fought back. And in 1177, the Cham attacked Angkor, and Angkor actually fell for a few years. Here's the Cham. They have this interesting hairstyle. I don't find it all that fear-inducing, but in fact, they were fearsome warriors. They have this sort of page boy hairstyle. There they are. There was a great battle on the Tonle Sap. There's the Cham Navy. There's a Khmer warrior, doesn't have quite the same hairstyle. They're fighting back. Here, unfortunately, a Khmer warrior is getting eaten by a crocodile. And the Cham were actually victorious. But there was a savior that came along, the third great god king, Jayavarman VII. He reigned. He was a cousin of actually Suryavarman II. He, again, Jaya is victory. He reigned, he ascended the throne, and they managed to extirpate the Cham from Angkor and take back the kingdom. And he would reign as a great god king. But you'll see that Buddha-like pose of J7, and we'll see that he was the first Buddhist king of Angkor, and it remains Buddhist to this day. There he is in a victory procession, victorious over the Chams. So he's the conqueror, the reclaimer, the builder, and the first Buddhist king. And he would build this mini city within a city called Angkor Thom, and many great temples. And he was also, he associated himself with the god of mercy and compassion, and he built 102 hospitals and way stations for travelers. So there's Angkor Thom, and it's a city unto itself. You can see we still have the Bares there. Angkor Wat is in yellow, and then Angkor Thom and some of the other temples are illustrated there. We can see all those squares on the periphery there are 5 entryways. Each we'll see quite impressive, with a face, a smiling, a beatific smile on the face of what's been thought to be the Buddha, the god of compassion, or more likely J7 himself, a combination of all 3. In the center is the Bayon, a great temple. So as you walk by, you'll be escorted there by, of course, the Devas. We can tell them by their cone heads, the Asuras, the demons, and you'll walk through these, you can go through these great gates. Again, there's 5 of them. And this is where you'll see actually well over 200. There's 54 towers just the temple with 4 faces each, so that's 216. So imagine being surrounded by all these faces. From afar, it may look a little bit like a jumble, but when you get up to it, it is just amazing. Now, this was, in its essence, the god or bodhisattva in Buddhism, an enlightened being that's chosen to stay on earth, of mercy or compassion. Lokeshvara. And Lokeshvara really was, in many ways, the key bodhisattva which J7 identified with. And in fact, it's thought that he represented himself as the earthly incarnation. He was consanguinary with this goddess, this god of compassion. This goes back actually to Hinduism, again, the Old Testament of Buddhism. Avalokiteshvara, again, this was a male figure, later might become more androgynous. The Khmer term for that was Lokeshvara, Lord of the world. It means that's how important this God of mercy or compassion was. Many, many depictions. You know the God of mercy or compassion as a female. Somewhere along the way, Avalokiteshvara, who became Lokeshvara in the Khmer mythology, in the Khmer religion, had a sex change somewhere along the way and went from male to androgynous to female. So you know the God of mercy, the Bodhisattva of compassion as Guan Yin. Here's a beauty. I love this one because it's made of wood, survived from the 7th century. So you'll see the goddess of mercy, this Bodhisattva of compassion in Taiwan. Here's one of the biggest ones. I always like to put my wife in for perspective there. There's Tina. Those of you who've been on cruises with us know that when I put her next to the giant Buddha of Polin or the treasury at Petra, she always looks very small, but she's actually, not a few inches tall. She's actually 5'7". So there's Tina for perspective. Thank you, as always, Tina, on one of the Guan Yins. This is actually the largest Guan Yin in the world. You can see some people there at the base. Same as Quan Am, carved into the Marble Mountain in Vietnam. That same goddess of mercy. There you go in Ha Long Bay, you can see Guan Am. In South Korea, the same, Guan Um. And in Japan, famously, Kanon. So again, in the Khmer system, that Lokeshvara, God of compassion, here he is. Is this J7 or is this the God of mercy? Here he is in the entryway to my home. Quite beautiful. This is a reproduction, of course. Wasn't very expensive at all. But I found a little, almost like a bowling ball type bag to take it out. And when I was leaving Cambodia, one of the customs inspectors, they're very careful, asked me, what's in the bag? And I said, a head. And he had a big smile on his face and asked me to open up and saw that it was a reproduction and passed me through. So there we go. But quite beautiful, that beatific smile, long predates other beatific smiles like the Mona Lisa. So wherever you look in this area, you see the face of J7 and the God of compassion looking out. It's also a great place to take pictures up here. This was a Harvard trip that I led a few years ago. It's always a great place if you go with a group to take a shot up in the Bayon, surrounded by those beautiful places, the beautiful faces. Now, again, this is a Buddhist temple. There's a Buddha, but there's Hindu symbolism there. The devatas are there too, the Hindu guardians. And there are apsaras, even in a Buddhist, holy Buddhist temple. So again, syncretic in Asia. Religions mix and mingle, coexist. We also see in the Bayon these beautiful scenes. Those are actual real handmaidens of the day, by the way, the king's handmaidens. We see the battle scenes that I mentioned. We see scenes of home life. We see cockfighting. That hairstyle is a Chinese immigrant to Angkor, and they're cockfighting here. J7 was a great promoter of healthcare. J7 Care was the best national healthcare that Cambodia has ever seen. There's childbirth right there in his network of 102 hospitals. So quite interesting. That not quite as fine as the stonework of Angkor, but very, very interesting. And here, this is actually the stonecutters and builders themselves working on the Bayon. If you look at them, they're carving in that bas relief. So the bottom line is plan time to see the Bayon. Now, in Angkor Thom, there are several terraces. There's a terrace of the elephants. Many of them are three-headed. Remember, that's Indra's mount. Erawan, the three-headed elephant. And those were places where the emperor would look out and greet his people and deliver proclamations. North of the Terrace of the Elephants is the Terrace of the Leper King. Unclear historically exactly who he was. Could have been Yasovarman I, who moved the capital to Angkor. More likely, it was just a statue that got enveloped in lichen and moss. and in fact was not related to leprosy caused by a mycobacterium, not at all. So in fact, the leper king may not have really existed, but very importantly is placed on the terrace of the leper king. But what's important about it is the carving, the intricate carving that you'll see on that terrace of the leper king. Ta Prohm is very, very famous just outside of Angkor Wat, but also built by J7, really as a monastery and dedicated to his mother. Sprawling monastery, over 100 acres, over 80,000 people lived in the whole complex, and it was the central offices of his hospital system. It was the centerpiece of his reconstruction of a reclaimed Angkor. You've famously seen the Tomb Raider temple. There's Angie in front of the temple from the movie, and this is just spectacularly visually interesting, but it's also very, very important in that this is symbiosis. If you took off these roots and these trees, these temples would disintegrate. And obviously, if you took any part of the temple away, the trees would die. So the armature that holds the temples together are these trees. There are many different types of trees. This is the most common one. It's called a false hemp tree. Just to get a sense of the size of these roots, that's a very big root. So there, my family is at the base of one of those tree roots. You can see these are very sizable. Again, we don't need to go into the biology in this lecture, but very interesting. It's called the false hemp of the spung tree, and it has this little spiky little flower. And you'll see that really the most common. But what you'll also see are these more sinuous strangler figs, also very famous as a visual icon of Ta Prohm and Angkor. These are ficus species. There's many different subspecies, but these are the stranglers, and they're also very picturesque, give you that really that Indiana Jones look. And then there's these huge trees, a lovely silvery white. Those are called kapoks. They're silk cotton trees. They're named silk cotton trees because their flowers actually look like cotton. So you'll also see those as well, and those are visually quite interesting too. So very, very interesting and different structure, but these were very important, and you shouldn't overlook. You'll love to see all the symbiotic trees growing with the temples, but don't overlook some of the beautiful carving like this Devata at Ta Prohm. Now, J7 would rule over all of Angkor, and remember, Angkor Wat was built by his predecessor, but in fact, it would be converted to Buddhist. So even though to this day there's a statue of Vishnu in Angkor Wat, we know that's because Buddhism is very welcoming, it's absorptive, it enjoys syncretically embracing other traditions. Now, it is said that that head was not the original head, so we don't know what and it looks kind of a hybrid, again, coexisting and mixing. The head itself looks like a hybrid of a Buddha and a Vishnu. But the Buddhists did not destroy all the Hindu iconography. In fact, all of those bas-reliefs that I showed you were Hindu. Here's coexistence. A reclining Buddha here is in front of a statue of Vishnu. And here's a Vishnu that was converted to a Buddha. Now, it didn't always work both ways. There was a Hindu restoration a couple of kings later. The king went back to Hinduism, and a lot of the Buddhist icons were smashed. That idea of smashing icons, by the way, classed as to break or smash, is where we get the word iconoclast from. Now, there were other powers that were brewing in the region that would ultimately lead to the fall of Angkor. The first proto-Thai state was known as Sukhothai in the 13th century, and they would become increasingly powerful, and they would have a breakaway state that became enormously powerful called Ayutthaya, the Kingdom of Siam. The greatest empire in the history of the world was at its zenith at that time, the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan. They had overrun China. First, his grandson Kublai Khan, and then his great-grandson Temur Khan would be the Grand Khan of China. That's known as the Yuan dynasty. During this time, so very interestingly and fortunately for us, although the Khmer were able to stave off an all-out invasion and occupation by the Mongols, they had to pay tribute. And whenever one paid tribute to China, China would send their emissaries and get the tribute and make sure everything was going okay. So they sent a young man by the name of Zhu Daguan in the year 1296. He stayed for a year and he wrote an eyewitness account, which was just translated into English in 2009. Absolutely wonderful to view this. He tells us, eyewitness, about the city. The gates are guarded, they're open at the day, they're closed at night. Dogs and convicts who are missing toes, convicts apparently that was what they did to them if you committed a crime, are barred from entering the city. Both men and women go bare-chested in Angkor. He found the women lascivious. The people make and drink 4 kinds of wine: sugarcane, honey, rice, and palm wine. The house of noble families are tiled, but common people, wood and thatch only. Senior officials wear cloth with multi-flowered pattern. Junior officials only get 2 flowers. So remember, when you look out from Angkor Wat at the jungle, this was really a city, an urban center, part of a conurbation, a network of cities of over 1 million people. But that jungle is beautiful today. I never cease to find a beautiful flower just around Angkor Wat. Now, he said the rank of the nobleman is proportional to the number of parasols. So we can see that was the noblest of the nobles, the king. When the king goes out, there's all kinds of pomp and ceremony. He leads their flags, banners, music, women numbering up to 500, clothes decorated with flowers, flowers in their hair, candles in their hands, and then palace women with lances and shields, then the private guards, goats and horses, all bedecked in gold, ministers and princes on elephants, umbrellas, those on horseback, hundreds of parasols flecked with gold. The sovereign stands on an elephant holding a sacred sword in his hand, and the elephant's tusks are encased in gold. Maybe a little embellished by Zhu Daguan, but may be reflective of the incredible glory and the power and the luxury that these god kings enjoyed. Here's 2 of the temples, Nikpin and Bapwan. I just mentioned them. Those are, he said, were covered in glittering gold. This is interesting. Phimianakis, it was in the royal city, again, also covered in gold. And Zhu wrote something very interesting. He said the king was expected to show up every night at the top of Phimianakis there, and every night the Naga would come to meet him, and the king would make love. He would have to make love to the Naga before going home to the queen. So according to Zhu, if he was a no-show, disaster would befall the entire land. So the king apparently had to make love to the Naga every single night. So, you know, in terms of the idea, I think Mel Brooks was right when he said it's good to be the king. It's probably even better to be the god king. But there's some things about it that could be tough, like that meeting on Phimianakis every night. Now, let's remember here, we've looked at J2, the founder. We've looked at S2, the builder of Angkor Wat, great expander of his kingdom, and then the reclaimer, the great Buddhist king, J7. I like to give Yasovarman the first credit too, as I do in my primer. I like to give him a lot of credit. He built important temples and he moved to Angkor. Now, the empire would enter a long period of weak kings, decline and disintegration. Out of Sukhothai would grow Ayutthaya, and the imperious and bellicose Siamese in that era would constantly invade Angkor. Again, the name of the town, Siem Reap, defeat of the Thais, reflects the many victories of the Khmer over the Siamese, but it didn't always work out that way. And Ayutthaya there, you can see it in that kind of purplish lavender tone, was growing and encroaching upon Angkor. The fall of Angkor, well, they built a lot, they expanded, they had all these enemy incursions from the Cham. The Mongols were really ready to pounce if they stopped paying the tribute, and of course the constant incursions by the Siamese. But they neglected the hydrologic infrastructure. So this article in National Geographic, it's on the reference list, would say that it was really the hydraulic engineering of the city that failed, and likely due to poor maintenance, too much money on temples and wars. Surely it was overpopulated. We know from dendrochronologic studies of the tree rings that in fact there was drought. There's lots of, what we can do now in history, instead of just looking at records, there are chronometric methods. We can use carbon-14. We can look, a simple one is looking at those sediment cores or tree rings. So there was drought and flood, actually. There were alternating periods. And some would say that flooding was a bigger problem than the drought, but after the droughts came the floods. Now, remember, this time, the 14th century, the plague was raging in Europe, the bubonic plague at that point in world history. And where did the plague come from, by the way? Interestingly, it really did come from China, migrated via the Silk Road and via the maritime trade, but it's likely that its origin was in China, again, caused not by virus, but that plague was certainly in Asia. That could have been a factor. I think a big factor was the ideological instability, which caused political instability. Remember, early Angkor was Hindu, worshipped Shiva, then they went to Vishnu, then they went to Buddhist, then there were, remember, a major restoration and some minor ones which were destructive. Remember those iconoclasts. The other thing is that the Mahayana Buddhism of J7, when Buddhism was restored, it was Theravada Buddhism. That's the Buddhism of Sri Lanka and Thailand, that sort of southern, more ancient Buddhism. It's much more spiritual, philosophical, introspective, really not consistent with the God King culture. The Mahayana Buddhism of China and Korea and Japan really accommodates that much better than Theravada Buddhism. But in fact, Angkor has been Theravada Buddhist for hundreds of years and is today. So that egalitarian aspect of it, that was really incompatible with that culture. And in 1431, it happened. The Siamese overcame, they sacked, they eviscerated, and they abandoned Angkor. And Angkor would remain under Thai hegemony until 1907. And in fact, it briefly went back to the Thai in the World War II period, but of course, it is very much Cambodian now. And it is very much Buddhist, Theravada Buddhist. It's a great Buddhist shrine. Now, I'd like to move towards a finish with a salute to Henri Mouhot. He was the one who, we can't say discovered because it was never lost, but he was the French naturalist, mostly an entomologist, but he was a naturalist, photographer, adventurer, wanderer who came upon Angkor in the year 1860. He was also a wonderful artist. You can see his sketches. He wrote this: "The temple is a rival to that of Solomon, erected by an ancient Michelangelo and grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome." He was also, I believe, had that travel spirit that we all have, that curiosity and the psychology of awe that we all enjoy. He wrote, "Seeing so much that is beautiful, grand, and new to me, from this I draw my contentment." An inspiration for all of us. The great thing is that it was always hard to get his diary for less than $50 or $100 because it's out of print. But last year, it went on to Kindle. So for $3.99, you can read Henri Mouhot's beautiful diary. I went to take a pilgrimage when I was in Laos on a medical project, donating some pulse oximeters for Lifebox. And I took a side trip because I was not far from where he is said to be buried. He sadly died of malaria at age 35 in the jungles of Laos. There was no road. There probably is now. The Chinese are building so many roads there. This was a few years ago. I tried to do it on bicycle and I basically ran out of time and steam. So then I did it on a scooter. That wasn't easy because this is a bridge that I'm going over. I just snapped this little picture as I was going over this bridge on my scooter. But eventually got there, came to this little trail, was in the right place, and saw the grave of Henri Mouhot, who died all too young, but left a great legacy because he certainly was the popularizer of Angkor and rediscovered it, or discovered it for Europe. So he leaves a wonderful legacy. And again, it's not just Angkor. We've looked at so many other fascinating sites and temples. It's spectacular, it's timeless, it's captivating. These are the creations of a magnificent 600-year jungle kingdom. Just Google John Freedman Angkor Wat, and you can see a little blog that I wrote about that to hopefully will resonate with this lecture. And I'm going to finish with what's going on now, which is just that we only know the tip of the iceberg. Thanks to LIDAR, which is light detection and ranging, different from radar, that's radio detection and ranging. It's a 3D laser mapping technology that you can do from the air. It's a remote sensing method. They are discovering a huge expanse of new engineering, new hydrological structures, and this basically metropolis around Angkor. So that whole area was much, much bigger than we think. And now they're taking it even further. They're learning that the entire thing was again, a megalopolis of linked cities. So this is Beng Malaya. That's what it looks like under LiDAR. When I was there last year, it's just verdant, overgrown jungle. You'd never guess that there was a tremendous city around that whole area. So we're just beginning to understand the extent of this magnificent civilization. So there you go. Feel free to email me, scholaratc@gmail.com. Feel free to take a look at some of my Twitter posts. Again, there'll always be some on Angkor and a lot of other things as well. And I hope that this resonates with those of you who have been to Angkor, inspires those who are going, and is just interesting and enjoyable to those who are taking the armchair traveler approach for the long term. But certainly in the not too distant future, Angkor Wat will reopen and we will all be on the road, satiating and at sea, satiating our curiosity. So we'll finish, as I said, with a quote from Andre Malraux. In a world in which everything is subject to the passing of time, art alone is both subject to time and yet victorious over it. I think that's certainly the case for the art and architecture of the great kingdom of Angkor. Thanks so much. I'm going to switch over. We're going to do a Q&A, and I'm going to go out of my screen share and see you all in just a moment. All right, so we've got a lot of great questions here. The first one is, where were the homes of the 1 million population located? Do we know what they look like? Well, what's interesting is that many of them were actually in that area around the moat between the outer wall of the Angkor Wat itself and the greater what's jungle today. So there were hundreds of thousands of people that lived just in and around the temple, but it expanded for many, many miles. And we now know not just hundreds of miles around Angkor as a great metropolis, but to other cities, which we now just see jungle. As I mentioned, the Beng Malaya temple, which is just verdant, overgrown jungle. That was a giant city. It was really a megalopolis. So they lived all around the greater area, and the 1 million estimate is just in central Angkor. In terms of, do we know what they look like? The best way to see them would be, remember those home life and contemporary life bas-reliefs on the Bayonne. That's where we see the day-to-day life, cockfighting, cooking, childbirth, stone carvers, and many, many other scenes of home life. So they gave us a window into what they look like. But remember, take a look at the reference list at some of, number one, at Zhu Zhiguan's description of the people. Take it with a little grain of salt, but it's quite interesting. And then also take a look at the articles on the LiDAR, all of the new areas they're discovering. So there's one question. Let's see, are most of these temples Buddhist or Hindu? Great question. They were all originally Hindu for hundreds of years. Remember that whole history. The mother cultures in Southeast Asia, Funan and Chenla, in Java, in Champa, were all Hindu. At the time of J7, Angkor converted to Buddhism, and in fact, he made the whole kingdom of Angkor Buddhist. But all of those temples you saw were originally dedicated, with the exception of the ones built by J7, like the Bayonne, were originally dedicated to Shiva. Angkor Wat itself, remember the Hindu god Vishnu. So really the answer is they were almost all, except the ones built later by J7 that I showed you, like Ta Prohm, dedicated, they were Hindu temples, but they became Buddhist. And remember, religion in Asia is syncretic. they embraced both traditions. It's hard for our Western mind to accommodate that idea. Our religions, the Abrahamic religions, are very monolithic. If I were to, look at it, sometimes I'll look at my audience of 500 people and I'll say, how many people here are Christian, Jewish, and also a little bit Muslim too? And no hands go up. Whereas in Asia, people mix. And there's a famous saying in Japan, a famous saying that I love. Japan is 80% Shinto and 80% Buddhist. So it all mixed together. Let's see, another question. What religion are the Cambodians now? And the answer is they are very much Buddhist, and they're Theravada Buddhist. Remember that southern, more ancient Buddhism, in my view, closest to the teachings of the Buddha, very spiritual, very philosophical, very introspective. And they also mix a lot of Hinduism and their own ancient folk religion into it as well. But Cambodia is a very, very much a Buddhist country. And like Thailand and Myanmar and Sri Lanka, Theravada Buddhist. Okay, now, so many great questions. How are the temples used today? The answer is that all of the temples that I showed you today are not in active use, but they're very active pilgrimage sites. So although many of them, like Ta Prohm, that Tomb Raider temple, was very much of an enormous monastery, today these are tourist sites, and they're very carefully maintained for that. These are not really actively used as monastic centers, but they are very, very important to the religion, and particularly to Buddhism, because the country is Buddhist now. They were all converted to Buddhism under J7, and despite the major restoration and some others towards Hinduism, they are Buddhist as well. So these are great pilgrimage centers. Borobudur, which I showed you in Java, and Angkor Wat would certainly be among the two premier Buddhist pilgrimage sites. The third, if I had to pick one, would probably be what I showed you early on in that slide of the temples of Bagan in Myanmar. Let's see. How new are the newest or youngest carvings at Angkor? Great questions. Some of those, the ones I didn't show you because they're nowhere near as finely done, were probably done maybe 100 to 150 years later. Remember, Angkor Wat, built over 37 years from 1113 to 1150. That's the reign of S2, actually. Built it his entire reign. And Angkor didn't fall forever with the sacking by the Thai until 1431. So there's a period of a few hundred years, and there are some new bas-reliefs, but they're probably not the ones that you're going to spend much time looking at. They're interesting as well. Many on the adventures of Krishna, which is an avatar of Vishnu, and other avatars of Vishnu. Vishnu had 8 avatars, so they all have interesting stories unto themselves. So they're interesting, but they don't have quite a fine workmanship. The ones I showed you are the original from the early 12th century. Great questions here. Okay. There's some COVID questions here. I think for now I'm going to skip over those. They're great questions, but if you're interested, take a look at my Twitter posts, because I address some of the specifics. COVID as it relates to people for whom traveling is so important, and we can't wait to get back onto the high seas and on the road again. And I address issues of evidence-based issues based on the vaccination and testing, which is something very, very important that we need to make some progress and a little bit of a curve on how we've been doing it. So take a look at that. I would direct you to that. But thanks for asking. That's of the utmost importance. Here's a good one. If planning a visit, how many days do you suggest staying in the area? The answer is, it's such a magnificent area, as you saw. There's so much to see. There's so much to see close by. A half-day trip to Bante Sre, not even, you can do it in 2-3 hours. A half-day trip to those temples of Roloos, which predate Angkor Wat. by hundreds of years. Not to mention going up to Phnom Kulen, to the mountains where the stone came from. All of these things are wonderful, and there's so many temples beyond Angkor Wat. So I would probably say a minimum of 4 nights, and you'd be just fine to spend a week there. The other wonderful thing about Siem Reap, that whole area, few other things. The people are lovely. The tourism infrastructure is extremely well managed. The food is fantastic, and to top it all off, it's relatively amazingly inexpensive. So I would say spend plenty of time. I've taken many people in on Yale alumni trips and National Geo trips and Smithsonian trips, and when we only have a couple of days, it's magnificent, but there's so much more to see if you have the time. So I'd say several nights at least. Okay. Here someone says, visiting Angkor has been a long time dream of mine. Does this seem feasible considering the COVID-19 concerns? And the answer is, of course, not right now, but I'm very optimistic for a magnificent travel and cruising renaissance. And I think everything will be better than ever, but we don't know exactly when that will be. So certainly there'll be a future. It'll take effective vaccines. And one thing to remember, after all the great hope of the vaccine, I've seen a lot in the press concerns about some of the new variants that may be less susceptible to the current vaccines. Well, it's not black or white. Even the data we have to date show that they're partially susceptible, which is of grave concern that they're not as susceptible. But also the mRNA technology is not just a wonderful new development in the area of fighting the spread of COVID-19, it's a landmark development in the history of medical science and vaccinology, so that this technology is very powerful, and one can very rapidly, as we've already learned, re-engineer these and put the right piece of RNA to send the right message to your ribosome. So I'm very optimistic about things getting much better with the vaccines we have and possibly others, boosters over time. And I think you'll definitely be able to visit this magnificent 900-year-old Angkor Wat and the areas around it. And the more you wait, the longer you wait, you can read up on it, and it'll be just that much richer to you when you go. Now, this says, wonderful. Lots of people say that it was just wonderful to go there. So we really have just terrific. Somebody asked me what month's issue was the 1912 National Geo magazine. I think I'm remembering it's March 12th, but you can take a look at that and double check me. You can get it in the archive. The article was by a writer by the name of Jacob Connor. It's a wonderful time capsule kind of snapshot in time of Angkor Wat before, as he said, anybody had heard of it. Somebody asked me also about the restoration. This again is kind of a whole other lecture, but there's been massive restorations that have occurred in a major way going back to 1905 when the French made a major effort, then huge efforts to this day by the Japanese, the Germans, by UNESCO, by the World Monuments Fund, and many, many others. So it's constantly undergoing intensive restoration for safety, for preservation. And, we didn't talk about exactly how they were built, the hundreds of thousands of workers and the tens of thousands of elephants and the various types of joints that they use, the natural resins, the slaked lime that they use to hold the sandstone together. But obviously the passage of time has affected this. So there are ongoing extensive restorations. There's a society in Cambodia called APSARA, which is an acronym involving the Angkor preservation, and they've also been very much involved. So I'm very optimistic, despite the tourism onslaught that it's been subject to. So there we go. I think we've got a lot. Let's say maybe one more, and then we'll wrap it up, if that's okay. Got a few that say just no questions, but nice comments. So thank you very much for that. And A lot of nice comments. Thank you. Very interesting. What happened to Sanskrit? Very good question. So Sanskrit was the written language of the learned Vedic scripture writers in India, where it all came from. It wasn't the language of the common people, which is why, if you look at the early Buddhist scripture, which is hundreds of years after the Buddha died, but the terms that were used that came from the oral tradition are in a language called Pali, P-A-L-I, which was the language of the common people, because the Buddha was egalitarian. So Sanskrit was a scholarly language. If we look at this, the stelae of those early Hindu Indianized societies, it was all in Sanskrit. But that's why I mentioned that in Chenla, we see for the first time an alphabet that is indigenously and newly developed, the Khmer alphabet, that would be a mother alphabet for the peninsula. So Sanskrit is still the language of the Vedas, the oldest scriptural documents of Hinduism. It was a scholarly, Brahmin class, priestly language, but it wasn't the language of the common people, and it still exists among scholars and among ancient writings. But from the time of Chenla, we would not see, sometimes you'll see something co-written in Sanskrit, but again, they had their own language, and that was their own alphabet, the Khmer alphabet. So there we go. I hope that that's not too much information for you. Have condensed a few lectures, but it's been absolutely delightful. I certainly hope to travel again with many of you, and those who I haven't met, hope to meet you in the future somewhere, and keep the faith, because as I said, there will be a marvelous rebound, epic renaissance of travel and cruising. Thank you so much. Take care. Stay safe.